Official spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation to the Middle East peace process in the early 90s and now as a member of the PLO Executive Committee, Hanan Ashrawi has come to be regarded by many as the voice of the PLO. She joins us now from Ramallah. Dr. Ashrawi, thanks for joining us. Well, we now have a ceasefire in place, a 72-hour ceasefire. What comes next?
Well, first of all, we have to make sure that this 72-hour ceasefire holds and is solidified, and then we need to work on extending it simultaneously with several other issues, including first a massive program for the alleviation of the suffering of the people, a massive reparations program to provide food, to provide shelter, to provide health care, to try to restore the electricity, sanitation, water, all these basic things that are immediately needed so that people can survive at least, and to try to dig up also. There are lots of dead bodies in the rubble and so on. And then we need to, beyond that, we need to go to issues of lifting the siege, because there's no way we can do any kind of emergency work or long-term work while the siege is on. And of course, respond to the needs for reconstruction of Gaza, which requires that Gaza is linked to the West Bank and that Gaza is linked to the rest of the world by sea, by air, and by land. And then we have to have a massive reconstruction program.
Right, let me ask you this about the ceasefire. Are all Palestinian factions on board? That includes Hamas, it includes the Hamas military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades. Are they all on board?
Yes, they are, and we've been working on this for a long time. Since the beginning, actually, of the Egyptian initiative, we have prepared a document on interpreting this initiative and expanding it. And we've had an ongoing internal dialogue with all the different political factions, along with their military wings. And the delegation that we sent to Cairo is made up of all the different representatives of all the factions. And of course, the PLO first, and then with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others. And it's both the military and the political who are on board. So now we are all speaking with one voice, we are coordinating, and we are also working in the context of the Egyptian initiative, and Egypt is dealing with the Israelis right now.
Right, you mentioned a moment ago that you want the blockade, the siege of Gaza to be lifted. Now, the Israelis have said a condition for lifting the blockade is the demilitarization of Gaza. No rockets, no weapons, no attacks. When that happens, the Israelis will consider lifting the siege. Is that going to happen?
It doesn't make sense at all, because you want your victim to be totally vulnerable, defenseless, while you, with the largest army in the region, with an air force with F-16s, Apache gunships, drones, tanks, warships, and so on. You want to have the freedom to use all your military might against a captive civilian population, but you want to make sure they are entirely defenseless. No, demilitarization comes when we discuss permanent status issues. When we are two states next to each other, we can discuss the issues of militarization and demilitarization. We think, for example, that Israel shouldn't have nuclear weapons either. And we think that you cannot resort to any kind of violence against the captive population.
Dr. Ashrawi, there are some analysts here in the United States and in other parts of the world who say that the purpose of the Israeli attacks on Gaza was to actually destroy that unity government that was formed just a short while ago. I want you to take a listen to what the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, said on the television program Meet the Press. Let's watch.
You have to fight terror. You can't embrace terrorists. That's unfortunately what President Abbas has done. Take the case of Iraq. Do you think the solution of Iraq is to have the Iraqi government just simply include ISIS as a member of the government? Because that's what the Palestinian government just did. They did it 2 months ago. We were very much opposed to it and very upset when the international community basically said, hey, this is a good thing for peace. It's a terrible thing for peace. The road to peace goes over Hamas. It doesn't include Hamas.
So there we have the Israeli ambassador outlining the Israeli position that they will not negotiate with the Palestinians as long as Hamas is at the negotiating table. You formed a unity government. How do you get over that challenge?
Well, first of all, I'd like to object to the false analogy. Hamas is not ISIS, and he cannot just keep trying to draw false comparisons that are entirely untrue and misleading. Hamas is part of a Palestinian political pluralistic system. They are part of a Palestinian democracy, and they have a political wing, they do have a military wing, they have also a social services department with all sorts of institutions and so on. So the question is not whether Hamas is at the table, because Hamas doesn't want to be either. I mean, we do have a government of national accord made up of independents, made up of professionals, people who are to deliver services, build institutions, and of course oversee the reconstruction of Gaza and prepare for elections. These are not card-carrying members of any party. These are independents. The PLO is the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. It is the highest political address, and it is the address that is entrusted with negotiations and with political decision-making. So all these objections are really very disingenuous and not true. It is just that Israel wants to divide and conquer. Israel wants Gaza to be separate from the West Bank and wants Jerusalem to be separate from the West Bank, to annex Jerusalem, to annex most of the West Bank, to bash Gaza into submission, to keep the Palestinians weak, to prevent the emergence of a strong and viable Palestinian state. That's precisely why they're clutching at straws, finding any excuse in order to prevent any kind of reunification or any kind of internal empowerment for the Palestinian people.
What do you make of the fact that there's been a significant loss of support from the Arab world for the Palestinians? And we saw that especially during the last 4 weeks during this conflict. In fact, the New York Times says Egypt has led a new coalition of Arab states, including Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, that has effectively lined up with Israel.
Well, that's not entirely accurate. I think the Arab world is undergoing a very painful and destabilizing transition. They are going through a very difficult period. There has been a difficult relationship between Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, which had a negative impact on the relationship with Hamas. So now all the Arab countries, regardless of any kind of alliances, realignments, and polarization, that they all now are dealing with a unified Palestinian voice. That's what we're saying. Palestine is not interested in being a member of any alliance. Palestine is not interested in being, of taking sides with any polarized group. We want to be part of the totality of the Arab world, and we will work with all the countries engaged or involved. And as such, we believe that if any kind of taking sides or bias will be detrimental to the Palestinian cause.
More than 1,800 Palestinians lost their lives over the past 4 weeks, something like 67 Israelis on the other side. Do you believe that Israel committed war crimes during this conflict?
Yes. I believe Israel did commit war crimes, did commit acts of state terrorism, and did engage in massacres against civilian population. And these are very well documented. And I think Israel should be held to account. You cannot sort of kill close to 2,000 people. 85% of them are civilians, women and children. You cannot demolish whole areas, whole territories, whole neighborhoods, turn them into rubble, pulverize residential homes and buildings. We still are pulling dead bodies from under the rubble and expect to get away with it or claim that this is self-defense. You cannot destroy institutions, including 121 schools, including a university, including government offices that are supposed to deliver services. You cannot blow up the only power station there is, and the sanitation areas department, and so on, and then not see this as war crimes or crimes against humanity or even deliberate massacres. So I think that all these things have been documented. The displacement of 465,000 Palestinian people who are in need of shelter now, a place to go. You blow up their homes. Many of them also were killed as a result of leaving their homes to find shelter. Right. On the way to shelter, they were bombed and shelled. And then, after having found shelter at the UN and UNRWA schools, the schools themselves were bombed, so many of them died in school, in the shelter that's supposed to be a safe haven for them. So there is a persistent pattern and a willful and deliberate killing of innocent civilians, including women and children.
What about Hamas? Has Hamas committed war crimes by targeting civilians with rockets?
Well, that remains to be seen, because there's a difference between an occupier and occupied. There's a difference between an invading army and people under occupation. We are looking into this. Some of the human rights organizations did describe the Hamas so-called rockets, projectiles, as bordering on war crimes, but the fact is Hamas did not kill civilians. Israel did.
Dr. Ashrawi, we just have a little time left, about 30 seconds. My final question, do you believe the two-state solution is still alive?
It's very questionable. I'm doubtful, because it's not just in terms of attitudes and so on, it's in terms of the unilateral facts on the ground that Israel has created, particularly its annexation of so much land in the West Bank, its ethnic cleansing of Area C and Jerusalem, its massive building of settlements all over the West Bank, and of course the siege of Gaza. So it's very difficult to see a two-state solution materializing, and unless there is a concerted effort immediately to halt Israeli violations and to produce a two-state solution on the basis of the 67 boundaries, then I think we will lose that opportunity for good.
Dr. Ashrawi, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you'll be able to join us again soon. That was Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Now we're going to take a break. When we come back, the view from Israel. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.